No vídeo passado, nós falamos sobre o caso do aluno faixa branca que no rola com seu professor faixa preta ficou tetraplégico e a justiça decidiu que ele ganharia 46 milhões de dólares por conta dos danos. E nesse vídeo falamos sobre a opinião da comunidade do jiu-jitsu com relação a essa decisão da justiça. E como prometido, eu legendei para vocês o vídeo do Rener Gracie, onde ele explica toda essa situação, o porquê que ele foi chamado para ser uma testemunha especialista no caso. E o porquê do júri ter decidido que o professor fez um movimento errado. Caso você não tenha assistido o vídeo anterior, vou deixar no final como sugestão para você.
Over a year and a half ago, I was retained as an expert witness on the Greener case to give my expert opinions, which I did. The reason I'm making this video is to explain the evidence as I saw it and the reasons why I felt this tragedy could have been prevented. Additionally, I want to share some of the things I learned along the way that I think will be very helpful for everyone from BJJ students to school owners. As many of you have come to learn, on November 29th, 2018, Jack Greener, a 23-year-old white belt in jiu-jitsu, someone who did have experience competing, was participating in a class at Del Mar Jiu-Jitsu in San Diego when, while sparring with the head instructor of the class, second-degree black belt Francisco Iturralde, sustained a broken neck, rendering him a quadriplegic, leaving him with significant and permanent injuries, including limited function of all four limbs, loss of sensation from the chest down, bowel and bladder incontinence, and much more. I want to start by saying this incident was a tragedy for everyone involved. At no point during the process was I asked to give an opinion on the intent of Mr. Iturralde, nor do I have one. I recognize fully that a mistake can be made and there have been no malice intended. I also recognize that it's possible to make an honest mistake and still be held liable to those that the mistake adversely affected. You could be driving your car, get distracted on your phone, cause an accident that injures someone, and even though it was a mistake and there was no ill intent, you may still be held liable for the injuries that the accident caused. In this incident, the technique that the instructor attempted to do while sparring was a particular type of rolling back take made famous by jiu-jitsu legend Leo Vieira. From the turtle position, when applied correctly, this technique directs the recipient of the technique over one of their shoulders or directly over their head. But when applied incorrectly, the consequences can be devastating. When correctly applied, the technique can be done from a body lock where both arms are underneath the recipient's armpits, or it can be done from an over-under grip configuration or seatbelt configuration with one arm over the neck and shoulder of the recipient and the other arm under their opposite armpit. There are dozens of instructionals online teaching this technique, and all of them use one of these two common grip configurations. In either of these correct applications, the most important thing is that the user's shoulder chocks the back of the recipient's head. Otherwise, the technique is not safe for use, as stated by Leo Vieira himself.
And then you place the head on one side and you roll to that same side.
I roll over my shoulder, pushing your head down because it's like a neck crank that forces you to roll. At the same time, that will make the position be safe for you to hurt your neck.
So one more time.
Yeah. So you see my hand almost touching the chin and then I bounce.
Okay.
So it's like I try to put my head inside here. So I move my head
Got it.
to roll. Float.
Doing it this way allows the user of the technique to maintain control of the recipient's head and neck such that the recipient is forced involuntarily to roll and to follow along with the technique. Here to help me demonstrate both of these variations, Cameron. So Cameron's in turtle position, and the two options that we talk about are double underhooks, where you have your hands clasped under their armpits and your elbows go tight. And this is where you dive your head forward right next to theirs, and you'll notice my shoulder go in the back of Cameron's head, pushing it straight down. So I lock, I pinch my elbows, we go up, and because my shoulder pushed his head, he had no choice but to roll, and that's what caused us to come up together and allow me the opportunity to get back mount. Similarly, if we're in the turtle position once again, and instead of going double underhooks all the way up under his armpits, I go over under, and I lock my hands here on his chest. I can put my head in the same position, roll my legs forward, and again, the pressure of my shoulder, you'll see right slow here on his head, gives him the combination of my shoulder on the back of his head, pushing it towards his chest, and the tightness of my arms around his torso makes it to where his body simply wants to roll to accommodate the pressure of that. Now, in the Greener incident, even though it was clear that something went wrong with the roll, at first glance, by me and everyone who's seen it on social media, it appears like the technique was done with the correct grip configurations. It's quick, black rash guards, roll, and it just happens. But upon closer inspection, it becomes very clear that that was not the case. Let's check it out. So since it's very hard to tell what's going on between two no-gi grapplers who are wearing black rash guards, this footage that was referenced several times during trial was edited to add color to the left arms of both Iturralde and Greener so that you can see where Iturralde's arms are relative to Greener's. So I'm going to go forward frame by frame here. And again, to the untrained eye, you're looking at this from a rear angle, it looks like he's in a normal over-under position. But what happens is, as you begin to kind of frame forward here, you're going to see that, in fact, Iturralde's left arm wasn't around the neck. It's, in fact, around the outer bicep-tricep area of Greener's left arm. And if you keep going further, you'll see that that arm continues to slide down to where essentially, as you can see there, Iturralde's left arm is binding Greener's left arm to his rib cage, completely removing that arm from the grapple. So as we continue to play forward here, you'll see that Iturralde then makes the decision with this modified arm configuration where the arm is bound to Greener's ribs and the opposite arm on the other side is underneath Greener's armpit. So one arm is under the armpit, one arm is binding it to his rib cage. So Iturralde decides to initiate the technique, diving forward, but in doing so, Jack lands straight on his head, his neck folding in one direction, both of their bodies folding in the opposite direction, causing the neck break. And then once it comes out here, you see once again Iturralde's two arms here, both in red, and Greener's left arm in green, and how Iturralde's arms are in fact around the torso and over the arm of Greener, instead of being over the shoulder in a conventional manner or in a double underhook manner underneath both of Greener's armpits. So modified arm configuration that resulted in the neck break. Let me demonstrate this one with Cameron as well. So Cameron, if you're here once again. So this is what it was, friends. Instead of being over under or a high double underhook, right? In both cases, Cameron has the freedom of his arms. In this case, Iturralde actually wrapped the arm and locked Greener's elbow into his body here. Right? And then he initiated the technique, diving forward, placing the forehead of Greener directly into the mat, going this way, and then forcing the head in this direction, the body in that direction, and then the torso is actually landing back in the opposite direction, causing the neck break. So what's important to recognize here is that there are two huge concerns when the arm configuration, instead of following the conventional methods, right, for the reasons listed, when you go to this modified configuration where you have a body lock, but you have the arm, right, encompassed in the body lock, the reason why this is problematic for this specific technique is twofold. Number one is that my shoulder is nowhere near his head, right? I can't have a body lock. My shoulder simply doesn't reach, so I cannot bind Cameron's elbow to his body and simultaneously chock the back of his head. It doesn't reach. Only if I were here can I reach, and even if I had double underhooks and my head goes to the ground, as you can see, my shoulder reaches the back of his head. But with the arm wrapped in the lock here, it's impossible for my shoulder to reach the back of his head. So that's the first problem, is I can't chock the head, therefore I have no control of the recipient's head during this technique. And as we know, control of the head is the number one prerequisite for the safe application of the rolling back take. The second problem with trapping someone's arm like this, besides not chocking the head, is that the recipient of the technique doesn't have their arm to just base out and frame and just support their weight, right? So even if I do a double underhook variation and I go forward, right, Cameron's arms still support his body from doing anything crazy. Any twist, turn, or fold in a random direction is much less likely because he has those arms framing on the mat. This is the humerus bone, the structure it gives him, right? His forearm, it's still his. Even though I'm high, he still owns the arm. And if I have a true over-under where my arm is in fact over the shoulder, once again, Cameron, reach over your head, move your arm around you so you can see. His arms are still his, you see guys, versus this. And now, I decide I'm gonna go full tilt straight to his forehead into the ground, boom! And then dive and flip and turn over, so.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yeah, so this was the added concern of having the arm trapped and not having the head control with your shoulder to essentially force the person to roll safely with the technique. That level of certainty and control, thank you, Cameron, you don't have when you don't have the shoulder in the back of the neck. And then add to that the fact that if things do go wrong, they don't even have a hand to be able to support themselves, right, and protect their neck from folding or their torso from going in the wrong direction and guiding themselves in a safer direction. They don't have that privilege when the arm is essentially strapped down to their body. As I said before, when executed improperly, the consequences are devastating. Mr. Iturralde went into a full headstand with Mr. Greener's arm restricted, placing all the weight of both of their bodies directly on his head and neck. And this is where the term spike entered into my descriptive equation, and I now understand that without clear context, that word can be confusing and misleading, and that was by no means my intent. Even though the technique used was not a spike in the literal jiu-jitsu definition sense, the effect that this technique, right, incorrectly applied had on Greener's head and neck was comparable to that of someone being spiked on their head. As seen in frame 70, you essentially have the weight of both men piled directly on Jack's head, with his head in one direction, his neck in the opposite direction, and his torso even further in the opposite direction. Besides the head, all we see are some feet and maybe the knees lightly touching the ground, but otherwise, it's all the pressure on Jack's neck which caused the break of his neck. Now, hopefully when you see this, you can understand why I might use that term, because it's my belief that the reason why the literal spiking technique is illegal in jiu-jitsu competition is precisely to avoid injuries like the one Mr. Greener sustained to his neck. And you guys, I'm not alone in my opinion that this modified variation of the rolling back take created unreasonable risk for Mr. Greener. The jiu-jitsu expert witness for the defendant testified that there are safer ways to do the technique. He stated correctly that by doing it with a proper over-under, you reduce the likelihood of creating unreasonable risk for the recipient. He also stated that he does not teach this variation of the technique where the recipient's arm is trapped to their body while they're driven forward towards their head and neck. And it's worth noting that on this expert's website, there are several videos, instructional videos, showing several techniques to achieve the back mount that place no unreasonable risk on his students or the recipients of these techniques. What's important for everyone to know is that the black belt instructor, Mr. Iturralde's testimony was also consistent with most of my opinions about this case. He testified that, number one, as an instructor, safety of the students comes first. Number two, an instructor must consider the risk and minimize it in teaching and executing techniques on white belts. Number three, there is no need to be unnecessarily aggressive or dangerous while sparring because it's time to learn, not win. Number four, an instructor must maintain control of their student when executing techniques that endanger the spine. Number five, the instructor must maintain control of themselves when executing the techniques that endanger the spine. Number six, the instructor should not execute a technique that can paralyze a student unless they are self-aware that they can do it safely. Mr. Iturralde also admitted that the grip he utilized disabled Mr. Greener's left arm, that he lost control of Mr. Greener's head and neck, and that he had no control over himself, which ultimately resulted in Mr. Greener's catastrophic injury. All of this points to the fact that this was a preventable tragedy. The video makes very clear how and why Mr. Iturralde lost control because he used the wrong grip configuration, which ultimately left Mr. Greener's head and neck exposed. And this happened well before the initiation of the forward roll. So there was an opportunity to correct the grip before initiating the technique. It was also brought out during trial that the technique used by Mr. Iturralde on the date of the incident had never been taught at Del Mar Jiu-Jitsu. Not only was this told to me by Mr. Greener, who has no recollection of receiving any instruction in that technique, but another member of the school who earned his purple belt, his brown belt, and his black belt at Del Mar Jiu-Jitsu and had participated in over 100 classes with Mr. Iturralde, had never seen this technique and had never learned this technique from Mr. Iturralde himself. Now, it's worth noting that never before in my life had I testified as an expert witness, and in this case, I only decided to do so after reviewing the tape, the footage of the incident, and realizing for myself the ways in which this injury was avoidable. And like most expert witnesses, I was compensated for the time that I put into this case. The expert witness on the defendant's side, who happens to be a second cousin of mine, also was compensated for his time. Now, the bulk of my testimony was centered around the question of whether or not Mr. Iturralde unreasonably increased the risk to Mr. Greener. And to be clear, malice or intent of Mr. Iturralde were not issues that I was asked to render an opinion on. Rather, my testimony was that, number one, this technique should not be used on white belts at full intensity by black belt instructors, because even when applied correctly, there still is a risk of injury if the person receiving the technique isn't expecting it. So the best bet altogether is to use much lower risk back take alternatives, of which there are many. Now, I know Mr. Greener had a history of competing as a white belt, but even still, the gap between a white belt and a black belt is massive. And as a result, the safest bet is to use techniques that, even if applied incorrectly, are not going to risk catastrophic injury for the recipient. Number two, the student should be taught the technique before that technique is used on them at full intensity in live sparring, particularly when a technique has such a slim margin for error like this one does. By having been exposed to the technique before it's used on them, there's a better chance that that student can receive the technique safely, even in situations where it's performed incorrectly. Number three, if at any point during any technique, a black belt instructor feels a shift in the position or the grip such that the risk of injury to the recipient has gone up in the middle of a technique, the instructor should abort the technique. Now, for this particular technique, we know of two conventional grip configurations that are safer than the modified grip configuration chosen by Mr. Iturralde on Mr. Greener. Now, when this happens and the grip shifts in the middle of the grapple, you have a decision to make. And in that moment, it's safer, it's wiser, it's better for everyone if the choice is made to either abort the technique or change the grip than it is to say, hey, I'm going to keep this grip and I'm going to force this one anyways, especially when doing so increases the risk unreasonably for the recipient. Ultimately, it was the failure to take any of these precautions that unreasonably increased the risk of injury to Mr. Greener. Now, I understand that there may be some fear in the BJJ community that this case may set some sort of precedent when it comes to injuries on the mat. You know, someone gets hurt at your school, you're automatically going to get sued and you're going to be held liable. And listen, this is not legal advice, but based on my experience in this trial, I'm very confident that this will not be the case. This was a very unique and preventable situation involving a black belt instructor who performed the technique at full intensity on a white belt student while sparring in the gym, having never taught the technique to the student, so the student didn't know what to expect, and having performed the technique essentially disregarding the conventional grip applications, making the technique unreasonably risky rather than choosing the safer alternative of the technique. It was the convergence of these very unique and extenuating circumstances that led this jury to reach the verdict that they did. Now, even though this was a very unfortunate injury that really should have never happened, being part of this process taught me so much. And part of my reason for making this video is that I wanted to share what I learned with all of Jiu-Jitsu so that this never happens again. For all the school owners out there, here are the 3 most important things that I learned being part of this case. Now, I can't give legal advice, so make sure you consult your attorneys. Number 1, waivers matter. Now, there is some lingering concern out there that waivers aren't valid. Now, in this particular case, the waiver wasn't admissible as evidence because of some technical errors in the waiver itself. But nothing has led me to believe that waivers as a whole are not valid. So once again, I'm not giving legal advice. This is just a good reminder to make sure that you get your waiver drafted by an attorney and you have it updated and checked often to make sure it's good to go. Number 2, get insurance. Every Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school should have general liability insurance, if for nothing else, to cover you in the event of a tragedy like this one. Fortunately, in this case, the school did have insurance, and it's my understanding that the damages owed to Mr. Greener will be paid by the insurance company, and that burden does not go on the school owner or Mr. Iturralde himself. Number 3, safety first. Even if you have a solid waiver and a general liability insurance policy, you must take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of your students. Being a part of this case taught me a lot about how the legal system defines risk and standards of care in this industry. Accidents will happen in any contact sport, but as long as you maintain the safety of your students as a top priority, you'll be in a much better position if something happens on your watch. Now, for all the students out there, if nothing else, let this serve as a reminder of how important safety is in the gym. All you have are your training partners, so don't break them. And never forget that training in the gym is not the same as competing in a competition. If you can't do something safely, don't do it. It's just not worth the risk. Everyone who knows me knows that my objective has and always will be to get more people to fall in love with Jiu-Jitsu. Now, in order to do this, we as a community must become better at preventing the preventable injuries. And it's my hope that by sharing what I've learned about this case, we can do better at that so that Jiu-Jitsu can continue to grow in popularity and in practice all over the world. Thanks for watching, guys.